I'm Dr. Green. For those who don't already know, I am on the faculty here at United, professor of pastoral theology and social transformation. And as you may also know, I direct the anti-racist initiatives here at United. And so this ST lunch is the anti-racism focused ST lunch. And for today, what we're going to do is actually engage some of my research that has to do with anti-racism, but has to do with anti-racism really in the context of athletics, in relation to Black athletes and particularly Black men. I'm currently working on a book entitled Playing the Game, Black Athleticism Beyond the Limits of Beast. And so some of what we'll be talking about today are ideas related to the work that I'm doing, more specifically related to my dissertation research in terms of the podcast clip that we're going to listen to. It's about a 7-minute clip of me in conversation with Dr. Ryan Sigelko. And that podcast will release next week officially. And so you'll be able to hear the whole conversation. But this snippet is really kind of where my dissertation left off and what it was about. And then the conversation we'll have today is kind of where I have gone from there. At least from the standpoint of how I'm inviting us to think differently about athleticism and specifically Black athleticism. And so it's very much an exploration. So I want this to be a generative conversation. I've got some questions that I will ask for the sake of dialogue. And then I'll share some thinking with you in terms of how I'm understanding, really redefining Black athleticism. And that will be a key piece of the work that is done throughout the book project. So Stella's going to share the podcast clip now, and then we will engage it after it's over.
Your research engages in a series of case studies in which you interview several current and former young Black athletes. You say that the goal of the project is to, quote, uncover the ways in which young Black men are seen as inhuman, evinced through lenses of sub- and superhumanity. You explore the history of the racialized trope of Black men as beasts, which you note simultaneously represents Black men as subhuman and superhuman, a source of both racialized fears and fetish. And you reflect on the former NFL superstar Marshawn Lynch, who you say epitomizes both the appeal and problematic racial nature of beast. I wonder if you could share a bit about the history of this racist trope and how you see it on display today in representations of young Black men and perhaps athletes in particular.
Yeah, thank you. I'll enter in through Marshawn Lynch as a model to speak about both that history and the contemporary, I would say, performance of that. When you look at Marshawn Lynch, especially when he was playing with the Seahawks and you know, he's got the dreads, he's got the tattoos, he's a big strapping guy. And he did not want to talk to the media because he understood what the media would regularly do to the narratives of Black players in terms of twisting them and making them, you know, they making them come off as something they're not. And so he began to be defiant with respect to the rule in the NFL that one needs to give interviews, and there's a minimum amount of time that you have to be accessible to the media. And so he would show up and he would just say the same thing, you might remember, but I'm just here so I don't get fined. And that was effectively his protest. To hear all of the language of like thug that came out of that by the media and by many, I mean, I would hear people talking about Marshawn Lynch as if they knew him. And so that was a problem. And for me, it pointed to a broader history that we see play out with respect to police violence, with respect to the levels of containment that you know, the extent to which Black men are incarcerated in this country, and how a common refrain undergirding all of those was this sense that this person was a threat in some kind of way, this person is in some way not capable of controlling themselves, so then there's the need to contain or control them, or perhaps even kill them, because black men free in the United States and in their agency and vocal are dangerous, are a problem for many. And so it's, slavery had to assume, the period of antebellum slavery had to assume that black men and women were not human in order to be able to treat them like chattel. When emancipation happened and you moved into Jim Crow, this is when beast, as something even more explicit, became even more politically necessary, because now you needed another way to control those same bodies that enslavement allowed you to do legally. So now this is when KKK, this is when the police were formed, as a way to continue that legacy of controlling black men in extra legal ways with different methods. Hence, that's when lynching comes into play. And that was based on, lynching was based largely on a narrative that assumed that black men were physically capable, kind of superhuman, but when it came to rational capability, or when it came to really what was defined as their humanity, they were less than, and therefore needed to be controlled because they were in pursuit of white women, and this was the narrative. They're physical beasts that are overly sexual, that are physical, all of that kind of stuff. So when you look at how that plays out today, some of the examples that come to my mind are, one is the language and the ease with which black athletes are called beasts, right, in the celebratory way, because there's a recognition of a kind of dominance or a prowess, an extraordinary capability in that sport. But how often do we use the language to talk about beast with Marshawn Lynch and it means something more than physical, right? It's always couched in this like physical capacity, perhaps devoid of humanity, or perhaps devoid of the same kind of sensibility that you would think about with respect to like a Tom Brady, for example. I'm trying not to get too much in the weeds, but even my interviewees in this dissertation project had a harder time calling Tom Brady a beast when they had previously defined beast as, this is something like when you were just dominating, right? Anybody can do this in sport. But there was a reticence to calling Tom Brady a beast, whereas there was a willingness to recognize the same thing in Marshawn Lynch. And underneath that, there was this sense of, well, Tom Brady's the GOAT. He's not really a beast in that sense, right? So you hear this even undertone even among black athletes. But, seeing LeBron James on the front cover of a magazine depicted as King Kong, the language of Beast of the East, or when Marshawn Lynch himself talks about going into beast mode and is describing it as going into a flow state, which is a neuroscientific, neurological level of functioning, a kind of an altered state of consciousness that lands more as intelligence than just looking at him as a physical specimen that's running around knocking people out the way. I probably went way off track, but hopefully, there's what I'm trying to do is there's a through line that to pull through. And I think in the world that we live in now, where everybody is exploited, and athletes are depicted publicly for the sake of just generating wealth and money and whatever, that it still plays on that narrative historically, but it does so in a way that is more celebrated and therefore is not recognized for the harm that it can maintain.
Right. Your research engages in a series.
Actually, share your screen.
Yeah, we should have given it.
I found this earlier today, just as an example that I'll probably come back to. But NFL posted something about Lamar Jackson, I think it was a couple of years ago. And Tom Brady actually commented on it, calling Lamar Jackson a beast in a celebratory way. For which Lamar Jackson responded and said, the GOAT basically has spoken. GOAT stands for greatest of all time. And so that just kind of illustrates in a unique way, because Tom Brady is directly involved in that. But that illustrates the kind of imbalance that, one of the imbalances that I'm gonna bring attention to. But before I go further with some of the ideas that really pick up on and develop the work of the dissertation, which seemed like eons ago, and I have moved on mentally from that project, but have reimagined it in new directions that ultimately move more constructively than just deconstructively, which the primary work of the dissertation was a deconstruction of this history of the beast, and the ways that it lives in connection with contemporary iterations of the same idea, but done so in a way that is palatable to a neoliberal capitalist society, one that celebrates Black athletic dominance, right? But in a commodifying way, and in ultimately a way that reproduces narratives that have been in place since antebellum slavery, at least. And so this project is picking up on that, is including that as part of the story, but ultimately trying to move beyond that to say, okay, if you're committed to reading us as bodies, first of all, versus minds, first of all, we need to deconstruct this false separation, right? But if you want to read us as bodies, then let's actually read what's happening in the body when we witness these athletic feats that people find mesmerizing. That's one of the moves that I make, is really trying to take seriously this engagement with embodiment, and to recognize that, one, the separation between like a kind of rational faculty, a cognitive capability, as right, the sole signifier of intelligence is a false, that's a myth. I engage the work of Howard Gardner, who, and his work came out years ago, but he's continued to develop it. And basically his theory of multiple intelligences is one that I have found useful, and follows some of the other Black womanists and liberationist scholars don't engage cognitive studies as explicitly as Gardner does. But this awareness of actually, we need to talk more about embodiment in full, and to be able to recognize the brilliance in Black embodiment, both in sports and outside of sports. And one of my the problem for me is that even in these positive spaces of acclaim, of celebration, when we use dehumanizing language about one group versus the other, this bleeds over into public life and society. It's not a leap to assume or to understand the connection between was it Darren, what is his last name, that killed Mike Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, and where he referenced Mike Brown as he felt like he was the beast. Right. And even the fact that that language would come to the fore of one's mind as a descriptor for someone signifies a shaping in their person's mind that has connections to our racial history. And so the more that we're iterating these messages and performing these connections and these tropes, we're reproducing this reality. And so I read sport as really a complex, an industrial complex, similarly to prison industrial complex, and the military industrial complex, that, you know, sport is a space where it's kind of set aside as a play space. And we know that some people approach it through the lens of entertainment, and other folks, it's life and livelihood. And yet, because of where it exists and how many tentacles connect sport to politics, to different aspects of social reality, we know that what happens on and off the field is consequential. And so sport functions really as a microcosm and a microphone for racial politics in the United States, and really globally, as we'll talk a little bit about here in a bit. So before going any further, I'm curious how this lands for you all so far. Is this something that you find yourself able to recognize, or does this feel completely foreign?
Yeah, I don't, I don't follow enough, sports nowadays to notice, those patterns until you point them out, but I definitely notice them in political language. And, and I know this isn't what you're talking about, but I also noticed that, that trope of, when you talk about subhuman, superhuman, the superhuman, the black athlete is naturally talented and the white athlete is hardworking. I notice that a lot. As if there's a moral component, a moral superiority of the white athlete, which of course trumps the physical superiority of the black athlete. It's just a very backhanded compliment
Yeah.
to say people are just naturally brilliant, as if Michael Jordan didn't put in thousands of hours of shooting baskets like everybody else.
Yeah, 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 very nice, very nice. Thank you, Amy. Go ahead, sir.
Hey, it's good to hear the podcast. I've been in class with you since 2020, and since then, I live in a world of white sports fans and watchers in both my families, my wife's family, my family, my friend group. We have a couple of people in our group who are Ecuadorian by birth, Filipino, one African American person. Um, to a person though, they are not with me in calling out this fact, this trope. And so I can't, to be frank, like I can't watch sports the same way with them anymore after learning about your dissertation, Dr. Green. And I'm set in what I see and hear, and my filter and how I interpret and understand that now. There are people who have watched with me, like my wife is a good example since then, who I will bring it up to and say, like, did you hear that? Did you catch that? That's the double-edged sword happening. And she'll be like, but usually he likes that. Like he wants to be called that. He's trying to live up to that standard. And I'm like, yeah, well, that's not his own standard. Like that's the standard that society, that we as a culture have set for that human being. And he's a paid sort of servant to the NFL or the NBA or whatever it might be. And maybe he's really high paid. And that's the standard that we as a culture have set. And it's not health, doesn't, just because it's real, just because we see it and it's ubiquitous doesn't mean it's healthy and that it's positive. Like that's the struggle, I think, for incorporating this level of analysis and seeing that you've provided, Dr. Green, in a world of sports fans who are surrounded by it every day, and it's reinforced by Tom Brady and everybody else who's looked up to as sort of being clean and crisp.
Yeah, yeah, thank you, sir. Yeah, and all the more when it pays so well in a neoliberal society, it pays and plays very well. There's a cultural capital built up around this idea. So to your point, young athletes, young Black, white, Latin athletes growing up all around the world, but specifically in the United States because of the play of this language, all aspire to be called a beast, because beast is set apart within whatever domain of sport in relation to whatever field they're playing. Field meaning not just the physical field, but field being the field of other participants in relation to whom they are trying to compete and kind of master this domain. If beast is set aside as if you're getting called this, you're doing something right, then absolutely everybody who aspires within this trajectory is trying to get there. Now, it's problematic when it's a Black player versus a white player, and then what that exposes is even the reticence and the hesitance to place white players in that category. Now, it happens. I mean, especially when we're talking about people like JJ Watt or even Nick Bosa, since we just watched the Super Bowl. Like there are people who, because of the physicality of their positions, will render them a beast, right?
Yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt, but like Christian McCaffrey is the leading rusher this year. He was in the Super Bowl as well.
Mhm.
I watched him all year, and last year when he was also, I think, the leading rusher, and I haven't once heard him called
I haven't either.
something about the aura of the white running back or white position, skill player or something. Sorry to interrupt.
No, you're good. And as we see, I mean, that in the Lamar Jackson in quarterback. And one of the points I was gonna raise when, after your comments, Amy, is just how this also connects to the separation, connects to particular positions within sports. And if you look at the evolution of the NFL, just the NFL, I mean, once Black players were allowed to play, then you start to see Black players only allowed to play certain positions. And all of the positions that are associated with thinking and cognition were reserved for white players, middle linebacker, quarterback, some of the offensive linemen, things of that nature. And then as it starts to become apparent that, you know, these athletes are bringing something that is really kind of evolutionary quality to the nature of the game itself, then you start to see Black athletes populating more and more positions, and now make up the majority of any given team. And yet there's still space set aside for certain positions. And within those positions, when, let's say, Tom Brady and Lamar Jackson play the same position, the way that their play is remembered in relation to that position are completely different. I remember hearing Jameis Winston referred to as a dual threat quarterback. Jameis Winston is slow as hell, but because he's Black, he was a dual threat quarterback. He could run and pass, right? Whereas there are, and then you hear pocket pass, right? Pocket passer means, for those who don't already know, pocket passer is like the opposite of a dual threat quarterback. This is someone who can't run, but who can stand in the middle of all the stuff that's going on and perceive and throw accurately and all of that, you know, oh, he's got pocket presence and these kinds of things. Even the subtleties of these different ways that commentators are making sense of play is playing out traditional, you know, historical tropes and stereotypes that ultimately are reproducing assumptions that we have about Black players versus white players, Black people versus white people. Any thoughts before I move on?
And I just think it's interesting. I think it was your panel in the fall, something came up about how white supremacy moves fast. And I feel like there's an interesting aspect of that too with commentating, where it's like the game's moving fast, everything's moving fast, so they're just saying things, not actually like taking time to think about how that plays out.
Yeah.
So it kind of plays into that aspect of like, yeah, meaning making moving very fast.
Yeah, like what's in you in this moment that you need to pull forth something, what comes out. But also there's an extent to which these things are scripted. People who are used, I mean, like I was talking about before we started, there's this NFL network segment called He's a Beast, where they would celebrate each week the phenomenal performances from the NFL games, and they would remember them as beasts in the ways that they have performed. Well, this is very much a scripted segment, right? So they're so completely over their head that the very nature and name of this segment is problematic because it's couched in a celebration. And I was mentioning to Dr. Sabia Tanis, I want to do a comparison. I haven't done this yet, but I want to do a comparison of that segment, which is led and kind of commentated by at least 3 white men who are former coaches and players, and 1 older school Black player, Michael Irvin. And then there's another segment that now is led by Ryan Clark, RG3, Robert Griffin III, 1 other player. I think they're either 3, it's 4 of them. All of them are Black or 1 of them is white. And this is called the Hemi Awards, which is based on this kind of he's him thing. You know, one of the newer kind of things that you will hear from Black players that is becoming popular among players in mass is this notion of I'm him, or even in women's sports, I'm her. And it's kind of like an I am statement that lands and moves very differently than I'm a beast. All right. It's almost a kind of signifier of divinity of sorts, you know, this kind of I am reclamation in the midst of what's happening. So I want to do a comparison of that because what it suggests, or what it at least invites me to think about, is, you know, who is narrating? And what do we hear when Black men, for example, are narrating their own experiences versus when white men are narrating our experiences for us? Now, it's probably not one-to-one, because if there was some, you know, Ryan Clark might host the He's of These segment. I don't know. But also noting how Black athletes are subject to these narratives as well. So to your point, Seth, just because someone might aspire to this or feel good when this is ascribed to them, it makes it real, but it doesn't make it right. All right, let me shift gears. I want to ask the question: if someone were to ask you how you define athleticism, what would you say? Or what comes to mind? Sorry,
Throwing out words out there, just kind of like strength or.
strength, okay.
Physical prowess.
Physical prowess, okay. Definitions of athleticism.
Bodily ability,
What was that?
physical or bodily ability to use your body.
Okay, all right.
Gracefulness.
Gracefulness,
Coordination.
coordination, right?
A commitment to your art with practice.
David, I think you've been cheating. Have you heard me before? Just joking. All right. Okay, what about Black athleticism? Do you see, or would you make a distinction? Why or why not?
I would say maybe the word heroic comes to mind for some reason, because just, I guess just thinking out loud, it was freestyling, but like a lot of professional sports that were, they would only have white people play at first. And then when the first person of color went to make that league, it was kind of a big deal. I mean, so I think of that as more of a heroic thing.
Nice, very nice. Thank you.
I thought of Flair for some reason, to be honest, to be real. Like I thought Flair, like Sha'Carri Richardson and Jackie Joyner Kersee, like that's what came to mind when you asked that way about Black athleticism.
I think it leads me to think of specific sports, like when you think about the Olympics, I'm thinking more track and field than downhill skiing.
Mhm.
I mean, the ways people are. The ways limits and opportunities, I think, function along regional lines,
Right.
shifts which sports.
Mhm. Yeah. Yet I am inviting us to think broadly in terms of the nature of athleticism as something that is developed to be deployed and applicable, and I'm using technical terms right now, I'll say something about shortly, and is applicable both with respect to the sport, but also outside of that sport. Is there something distinct about Black athleticism versus just athleticism? In the same way we might think of theology versus Black theology. Takers?
Also complex is the word that comes to mind, because especially for a star athlete, like, I'm not super into pro sports, but the impression I get is that a star athlete, if they're, I guess if they're white, for example, it's kind of like, yeah, you did a great job and everyone's pat them back in school. But if it's a person of color who's a star athlete, it's kind of like, they get this, maybe some of the same messages, but I mean, as a white person, I'm just speculating, but as the athlete of color is like kind of balance all these other pressures of like racism and like weird expectations and all this stuff. They've got to balance all that and make it look like they're not even worried about it.
Nice, nice. I'm liking these words, the heroic, the flair, the complex. And all of these are correct. All of these point to elements of perhaps the way we might distinguish Black athleticism. But one of the things I think helps is when we begin to think differently about what is athleticism, how do we actually define athleticism? And so one of the things I will say and kind of work through toward this working definition, and then we can talk a little bit about some of the ways that I'm thinking about this definition and just kind of see how it lands. I did not formalize this beyond what I could with the time I had. And I'm also not to the point where I'm ready to decide on a final structure for how I want to break open this definition. So I've kind of left it open-ended on purpose. But we can begin with acknowledging that I'm arguing Black athleticism to be understood as embodied brilliance. And when you think about brilliance, a definition of brilliant or the quality or state of something being brilliant, what you're talking about as an adjective is marked by its glittering, distinctive, excellent nature. This is according to Merriam-Webster. As a noun, it's marked by the imagery of a gem, such as a diamond cut in a particular form with numerous facets, so as to have special brightness or brilliance. And what I want to focus in on is the facets part of it. Because to be multifaceted or to have many aspects, that is a great word that helps to get at just how flattened our current understanding of Black athleticism is. And really how flattened our understanding of athleticism is in and of itself. There are aspects to athleticism that beast, simply cannot capture, nor is it designed to open up curiosity. In fact, it does just the opposite. Even in its most positive usages, beast registers as mere animalistic talent. It's designed to disclose and to label based on this assumption that someone either has this genetic kind of gift or not, right? And so an athlete or somebody who is athletic, the connotation is they've got it.
Yep.
Right? What that is actually referencing is their genetic makeup, the cocktail that they have been given based on their lineage, based on environmental factors, based on a whole host of things in terms of how those genetics express themselves. But the athleticism has nothing to do with the genetic predisposition. But the deeper and so the way that we think about this is as a gifting that is largely genetic, the one either has or they don't, it lands as something that cannot be coached, but strangely requires a coach for control in service to cultural productivity. So the kind of physical specimen that doesn't have the same kind of nature as the one that gets to coach the physical specimen into appropriate participation in whatever field they're relating. The deeper connotation suggests one that exists with a lower nature, fundamentally inhuman, though never explicitly stated that. Yet the repeated performance of this myth shapes our cultural consciousness in a way that prevents us from recognizing athleticism, especially Black athleticism, as brilliance. I showed the Twitter kind of feed earlier, but one prime example is the way that, I interviewed for my dissertation 5 Black current and at the time current and two former NFL players. And we talked about how culturally we define beast. Well, the consensus was it's based on someone's performance. It's based on a certain level of dominance, a certain level of expertise in their field and their craft and what they're doing. And then we talked about who is a beast and who is not, basically. And I asked the questions about Marshawn Lynch, for example. Of course, man, Marshawn Lynch is beast mode. Like he's who we think about when we think of beast. Well, can Tom Brady be a beast? And there was a hesitance to putting that label on Tom Brady, but rather it was more so labeling Tom Brady as the GOAT, greatest of all time. Now you could survey about other white quarterbacks, and my suspicion is that there would be a hesitance to call them beasts. Whereas the best Black quarterbacks, i.e. Lamar Jackson right now, Tom Brady himself called the beast in a celebratory way, right? Giving him his flowers, but giving him his flowers shrouded in this racial history that we cannot get away from. And so I'm thinking about one of the things about athleticism that I'm wanting to highlight is one, I want to make an argument that athleticism in and of itself is a form of intelligence. To the extent that, and this is kind of in conversation with Howard Gardner's work and some other thinkers' work, but when we think about the nature of intelligence, historically, we have thought about intelligence as in similar way that we think about athleticism or athletic ability. Someone either has it or they don't. And more often than not, it has been associated with cognition, with rational faculties, with that which is of the mind, as if the mind is a separate entity from the body. It doesn't recognize the fact that the mind is occasioned by the body. And that all of this, all of our embodiment is actually what's experiencing this journey through reality. It also doesn't acknowledge the way in which athleticism as something that is developed and deployed and that is translatable across domains, and that once one has developed it, one has it. Now, this is not to say that their physical body can continue some of the feats that they would have when they were like, there are some things I can no longer do. Or if I do them, they will hurt for a long time. All right. So my body can't do the same level of feats, but when you think about the wiring in my brain for certain steps, certain movements, certain techniques, I was talking to my dad last night, who played 9 years in the NFL, 7 years for the Chiefs, and he's in the Chiefs Hall of Fame. So of course he's watching the Super Bowl. And I'm talking to him about what he notices when he watches a game. And he played cornerback, defensive back. So of course, every time a defensive back is on the screen, or when a defensive back gets beat, immediately he knows why he got beat for a touchdown. Well, his eyes were not on the hips. His eye, there is a kind of intelligence. And the other thing about the nature of intelligence, as the way Gardner talks about it, is this is something that, once developed, just like a craft, just like whatever it is now something that has essentially been downloaded, and that you can move in relation to in largely second nature ways, where you're not having to consciously think about, your prefrontal cortex is not having to do the kind of executive work in order to carry out a task, but now it's second nature. It is moved to the back part of the brain, and you don't have to think about what you're doing. So when you hear phrases like, well, then the game slows down, and all of a sudden time dilates, time passes slowly, i.e. you're in a flow state, you only get there as a result of having developed a certain kind of expertise that makes whatever is potentially playing out in this field something that you've seen 1,000 times before, and something that you can actually show up creatively and in a kind of innovative way in relation to, because you have such a dexterity built up around the systems of movement, right? So athleticism as a form of intelligence in and of itself. But also another layer of that is athleticism is actually a blend of intelligence. According to Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences, and we know this. We know that there is a difference between kinesthetic intelligence, which there's a whole kinesiology field built around the recognition that there is a kinesthetic intelligence that is different from like a kind of rational intelligence, that is different from musical intelligence. And what Gardner does is he pulls apart at least 8 or 9 different forms of intelligence that human beings have by nature of being human. And that he defines them as really relatively autonomous kind of biotechnological systems that happen in our bodies that allow us to develop certain expertise in certain areas, and that are geared toward, the domain of sports or the domain of music or whatever it might be. So all of us are synthesizing a variety of different forms of intelligence based on the fullness of our embodiment, And so if we were to think about athleticism on a kind of molecular level, you watch the things that Steph Curry does, or LeBron James, or Marshawn Lynch, or Tom, or whoever it is, and thinking about, the ways that, athleticism is typically overdefined by one's body, what their body's moving in space. But there's a certain like mental, intellectual acuity that is happening when one is shooting a basketball, coming off the screen, shooting a basketball with somebody in their face. There's a kind of executive judgment that is taking place. Do I take this shot or not? There's all kinds of things taking place that are drawing on a multiplicity of different forms of intelligence all at the same time. And even the training process to get to the point where that becomes second nature enlists all of oneself. No human person is born with all they need to become an elite athlete. Right? Which speaks to the level to which training, conditioning, is really a kind of spiritual practice on top of being an intellectual exercise that simply is embodied in full, rather than sitting at a desk and assuming that I'm a genius because I'm only doing this form of intelligence in relation to a field that pays a lot more and that is explicitly white, so we make it legible as something that is more important.
What you're saying also reminds me of, I had a friend who was at the US Olympic Training Center in archery. And one of the things they said is once your body knows what to do, you can improve almost as much by simply envisioning it.
Yeah.
And your odds of getting hurt are less. And
Yeah.
so part of their training was simply envisioning the perfect outcome.
Yeah.
And that once that it was almost, it almost did as much as actually practicing.
Absolutely.
In fact, in some ways it did more because the person was able to enter into the flow state, but when they picked up the phone, yeah, they were in it.
Absolutely.
And so I think when we discount the intellectual side, we're missing the fact that we're actually able to do that with our brains.
Yeah, yeah.
And the same study said, even if you, as long as you know what mechanics to do, it doesn't matter how good you are, you can actually improve yourself.
Absolutely.
That was
One of
fascinating
my-
to me.
Thinking,
Friends and
I'm thinking also,
Go
I'm
ahead.
sorry,
Go ahead.
trying to raise my hand, but I know it's a tiny little thing up on the screen. It also just reminds me of, I'm trying to learn to play the piano. My piano teacher says this all the time. She says, you'll get the muscle memory after a while, and it's, of course, in anything physical, cooking, visual arts, anything that requires physical activity, there is that shift at some point where you don't have to think about it all consciously, but it's a tremendous form of intelligence. And I don't think we discount that when it comes to the arts.
Right.
But we do when it comes to athletics.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and the process of getting to that point where you are moving with expertise based on second nature. That's a neurophysiological remaking of oneself. And that suggests, and I'm trying to figure out how far to go with this, but in some of the conversations where when we think about the divinity, for example, well, I'm not gonna go that far, but I will eventually. If you've read Philip Butler's book, Black Transhuman Liberation Theology, you'll know where I'm gonna ultimately pick up on this notion of vitality and this notion of divinity as something that we interact much more closely with than has previously been talked about. And so I think that there's something significant to the fact that we have both the capacity and the responsibility of remaking ourselves. And I mean that in the most materialized way. When you consider the fact that muscle growth, for example, if you lift weights or you're doing a certain kind of training that is designed to increase the size of muscles or the strength of muscles, the first thing that has to happen before the body or the muscles actually take on this new form is that there's a wiring that is happening. So for example, lifting heavier weight than you have previously lifted recruits, and this is the language used in kinesiology and the language used in sports medicine and just kind of the movement mechanics of training. we talk about muscle memory. It recruits new pathways in the brain that ultimately become the structure upon which the new muscle material will exist. But once that material is made, then the muscles all of a sudden have this memory as well, where you could be injured for a year and not be able to work out, but the quickness with which you would get back to where you were, assuming that, generally speaking, you hadn't aged 10 years, but within the same kind of time frame, you could get back to very quickly what had taken you 10 years to build up. Because your body remembers.
Yeah.
And the same way we talk about our bodies remembering trauma, our bodies, there's a brilliance to our embodiment that I think is the ultimate argument in this, is to recognize, and not just, the brilliance of Black athleticism, but in as much as that can kind of give us a way into appreciating Black embodiment more broadly, and the brilliance of all of our embodiment, and the real consequences of the capacities that we have. And so this is very much a way to talk about this. And let me say one more thing. So as a form of intelligence, as a blend of intelligences, for the technical person that wants to say, well, technically it's kinesiology. Okay, well, let's talk about what is all synthesized and integrated in this athletic act. But there's also a cultural dimension. I think that athleticism, in as much as it reflects the particular formation, conditioning, all of the kind of remaking that one is going through in themselves, that you can't pull that away from the cultural dimension. So when you talked about the heroic or the flair or the complex, what kind of signifying or referencing is the cultural surround in which this person is not only performing, but is also training and preparing and developing this intelligence that to varying degrees has been developed with a racial consciousness, perhaps not a racial consciousness, but a Black body performing athleticism in the United States, whether they see themselves as Black, is seen as Black. So there are the marks of cultural realities that are all over their built up intelligence that we call athleticism. So that's kind of the connection that I'm making, and I have to develop that more. But, Black athleticism as something, because athleticism as something really central to the formation process of a person. A human that is putting themselves through that thorough going of a transformation for whatever ends it might be, there's no part of it, it's not a compartmentalized process. I'm not training and leaving my spirit at home and leaving my mind over here. It enlists all of us. And one of the primary examples of that is even to the molecular level of generating more muscle proteins is a fully embodied process that requires focus, intention, and it is reflected in the brain chemistry and ultimately held once it's created. And I would blow that up to argue that much the reason why we continue to struggle with racial conversations in the United States is because we don't think about it as the need to develop racial intelligence. It's stuck at the level of morality. So we're more concerned about, I don't want to come off as racist, than I want to learn how to move in relation to everybody.
May I share?
Yeah.
Jeez, that was amazing. Thank you so much. I just feel like I had this experience this week of like what you're saying, like, well, I've been in EMDR trauma therapy for like 3 years, and I don't know if you don't know what that is. It's like you're like reprocessing traumatic memories and forming new neural pathways that are safer. And really it's about like ultimately believing that the world is a safer place to live in. And I could feel that, like, so I work train at this yoga studio, and I could feel that like I'd done all this spiritual work and emotional work, but I needed to do physical work.
Yeah.
I was like, so I felt like this like lining up of like, oh, I have this opportunity to like be at this yoga studio. And like, this is really the task for me this year is really really focusing on the physical athletic body part. And I couldn't really, but it was like to get my body online to want to do it, I had to form new neural pathways in my brain through trauma therapy. So it was like I was needing to like connect my brain with not being so afraid of the world, with like being able to get back in my body to care about it enough to do the repetition. And I really did feel, and I feel very like intense right now because like yesterday, I truly felt like I like opened up a chakra in my body that had been closed down for like most of my life from like early childhood trauma. And that like the like getting back online and feeling safe in my body, I looked around and felt safer, and I felt the racial dimensions. I was like, I'm looking around and literally feeling safer with all of my neighbors, like in a different way. And just feeling that like conditioning really just being held like in our bodies on that fundamental level. And it was, yeah, just like very like, whoa. To be like, all of it feels safer and like it's all connected and yeah,
Thank you.
yeah, thank you.
It's a constant conversation. I mean, it's, you know, and we have to be, I think the more that we can begin to think outside of this mind body separate, you know, and just recognize that, you know, I think about when my son, for example, was learning to walk, or when my daughter, for example, when she was a baby learning to walk. It's not something that just happens exclusively in the brain. It's a performance that is practiced and practiced and practiced and honed and honed and honed until it becomes second nature. And that is a conversation between all the parts of my being, my embodiment, including the brain, but not this unique mind capacity. And I think also, when we privilege this kind of singular understanding of intelligence, we set ourselves up culturally for not being able to recognize neurodivergence in ways that we need to recognize it, and to recognize brilliance in all of its forms. And so there are a host of issues that I think spin off of our failure to really take seriously embodiment. But for this, I mean, the sports and trying to reread Black athleticism is one that I've been thinking about for a long time. And having my head down in a book project, and I finally get to say it.
Amazing.
What I'm curious, we've got like 5 minutes, I think. What other comments or questions are folks having, or just things that are coming up for you?
I got the green. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, Sarah.
I didn't raise my hand. I just
That's
interrupted.
okay.
I was a couple things. As we were talking, I was also just kind of thinking about the superhuman
Sarah,
quality.
you're sounding muffled.
Oh, can you not hear me?
No.
It might be the AirPods, yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Try it again.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Great, sorry. I was thinking a little bit about that sort of superhuman component when it comes to healing as well, that there's sort of, I think, more space and grace given to a white body that needs time to heal, that, you know, maybe they need to take a season off or something like that. Whereas the Black athlete is expected to get back out there, and that they would more quickly be able to get back to their physical, you know, excellence. And another question I had, or thought I had, which is a definite departure, but you talked so much about the NFL. So I just was curious if you happen to see the Super Bowl commercial. I have a lot of issues with football in general, so did not watch the Super Bowl, but was around adjacent to a big group of people watching the Super Bowl. They pulled me in for the two favorite ads. One of them was one of the Ben Affleck donut ads, which was very funny, I will say. But the other was the little boy in Africa, the NFL's ad, sort of advertising for joining, NFL's camps. And the whole room full of people watching the Super Bowl was like, "Oh, this ad's so great." And my response was like, "Oh my God, I felt nauseous." And in that moment, the Super Bowl keeps going and somebody was like, "Well, what's going on with you? Why didn't you love that?" And I said, it just reeks of, are they trying to reference slavery and colonialism and what's going on here? Like, oh my God, this is horrible. And so I just was curious what your take was on that.
Yeah, I do remember seeing that ad. I want to comment on what you said first about the kind of superhuman and healing. And even outside of Black athletes, that made me think about the way society renders Black women superhuman in the ways that they should be able to take on and carry so much, right? And you see that in birthing narratives. The medical industry in and of itself, and the history of Black women, and the presumptions that Black women can withstand, that is inscribed on them, is a feature that where beast in this kind of way shows up in Black women, and what's inscribed onto Black women, albeit different in terms of gender and such. But as far as that ad goes, listen, the NFL is a multi-billion-dollar organization that has figured out a way to exploit the vitality, whereas it began as a sports in large part began as a segregated space where, Black players would play over there and white players would play over here, but you couldn't play over it. And then now you see, as a result of integration, now the majority of teams are, especially in NFL and NBA, for example, are boasting majority Black players. And then you have these combines. You have the NFL combine that comes up later this month, where you got I don't know how many players, but basically the top prospects from colleges, who are trying to make it to the NFL. And they will show up and they go through a series of tests. And the imagery of it is basically a slew of white men standing around with their clipboards and pens, watching a slew of Black men running, jumping, testing, being measured with just underwear on. And it's eerily similar to the plantation politics of the antebellum past. And so when I think about the NFL within this broader neoliberal society, already working on expanding to Europe, and because they've been testing out the fan base by playing games in Europe for the last several years. Now you're starting to see the NFL trying to get into Africa. And we know that they're not getting into Africa or other parts of the world to change the makeup and dynamics of the front offices.
Right.
And so, let's be clear. If you can go to Africa and recruit and get players, not just to play in the States, but eventually set up shop in Africa, so all that going.
Thank you.
Maybe one more question? Oh, two more.
I've kind of lost track.
I was curious about in terms of social transformation. One positive people cite about the NFL is that it actually focuses people on connecting with each other across regions and geography, and then also that people do get to see a team of Black and white players. And I was really curious with this issue with Taylor Swift. now people in this room have taught me basically everything I know about football and about Taylor Swift, so I'm ignorant, but, I was really curious with this MAGA thing and like because like people joke that like football's the one thing you can talk about at Thanksgiving without getting into politics or, you know, in the same way. And then this injection of like a white MAGA crowd attacking a white woman, you know, basically, and the booing of her and things when she literally was doing nothing,
Right.
you know?
Right.
And I really felt like it was a way to introduce some, like this element, and another element of whiteness layered onto it, and politically divisive whiteness.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I've been thinking about this in terms of in some ways erasing while there's all these. Yeah, I never knew about the combine before you, so like, I mean, I'm horrified about it, but I actually thought like this is a way to actually even make the one thing that has some benefits for our vision of black and white players together or something like that to then be pulled into this sort of insidious divisive whiteness.
That's interesting. I wasn't familiar about the MAGA response to Taylor Swift.
Oh, she's a PSYOP recruited by the FBI. There's a whole
Can't find an
conspiracy.
election.
Right, exactly,
I
yeah.
will say, to your point, Dr. Sabian Tanis, that in addition to, there are things that happen in the context of sport by nature of bringing people together that can be very transformative. And more often than not, it's like a little bit of the good with some of this bullshit that you're gonna have to take in also.
Yeah.
But I will also say with respect to Taylor Swift, and I'm smiling because, while some sports fans appreciate her being inserted into, there are others who, for whom it is actually divisive.
Yeah.
And you know, and of course, you know, depending on how big of a Travis Kelce fan you had been, and the fact that Travis Kelce had dated black women before Taylor Swift, and you know, so it depends on who you ask. But it's the give and take of those play spaces, or those spaces of intersection, and it is fascinating to pay attention to the Taylor Swift dynamic, in as much as it might be unifying and kind of polarizing. But I wasn't familiar with the MAGA folks.
Oh, yeah, there's a whole conspiracy theory around her infiltration of the NFL and.
See, my assessment would be obviously that's.
But I also.
But I mean, the NFL, listen, ratings, viewership, and revenue went up drastically when they started showing Taylor Swift at games. That was one of the best things that happened to the bottom line in the NFL. This is why every single time the commentators would mention Travis Kelce, that camera would go straight to Taylor Swift.
Yeah, and we were noticing that Simone Biles is also dating an NFL player, right?
Yep.
And the camera does not go on her.
Well, thank you all for this conversation. This has been fun and enriching, and I have to go teach class.
Thank you.